Hello, this is Ken Ferry with this week's Boots in the Field. The question of the week today is a question that I've heard in multiple places. I heard it in 3 different meetings that we did in Pennsylvania and one in Ohio, and I've heard it here in our meetings from this winter, and that has to deal with sulfur. The question is, do I need sulfur in my fertility program? And if so, basically, what are the 4 R's for sulfur? As far as the right place, the right rate, the right timing, the right product, what do we use? The answer to this depends. It depends a lot on air quality and where you live. So while air quality has improved all over the United States, if you live in an area downwind of heavy populated areas, you're still receiving some of this acid rain or sulfur. So the situation we talk with farmers in the east, they still may have adequate sulfur levels to meet their demands out there itself. Compared to us here in the Midwest, where we don't have as much population to deal with, as much manufacturing out in the country to deal with itself. So basically it means that areas in the east, again, probably still have enough sulfur, but it's time to start checking tissues, soil test, putting out trials, and looking for a response to that sulfur to see if you can actually put it on and pay for it. Here downstate Illinois, we do get big responses from sulfur applications, as we showed in this year's plots itself. We had from 3 to 35 bushel responses to broadcast AMS. We had a 15 bushel response. So situation, the sulfur responses are fairly strong and have been. But then again, when I came to Illinois over 30 years ago, sulfur tests in this area here in Illinois were between 25 and 30 part per million in a 6-inch sample. The ones that we're pulling today are between 9 and 15. So you can see there's been a drastic cut in the amount of sulfur that we have to work with as we've cleaned this up. So that's why we're seeing some pretty strong responses. But even here we see a little bit less response as we crowd up around Chicago where there's more pollution to deal with. So it's an area where it does depend a little bit on where you live. It also depends on your soil and how much sulfur is stored in it. So the higher the organic matter, the less likely you are to respond to sulfur. The lower organic matters, the more likely you are. So a situation we think about the 4 R's of sulfur, the thing we need to remember is plants take up sulfate, and as a form of sulfur, that's the only form they take up. So elemental sulfur has to be converted microbially, just like nitrogen has to be converted to nitrate. Elemental sulfur has to be converted to sulfate. And that's going to be driven by the microbes in the soil, and that's going to take some time if you're putting elemental versus sulfate on itself. Sulfur deficiencies usually occur in early growth in the spring. Most of the time, sulfur deficiencies will correct themselves by the time corn is waist high and beans are about V6 or so. So early uptake of sulfur is kind of crucial. So when we're applying sulfur in the spring, if we were broadcasting it, we need to be sure that we're in a sulfate form, something the plant can use right away. If you're going to use elemental sulfur, it should be applied in the fall, so you have time for it to get converted so you don't use it. Putting elemental sulfur on in the spring, by the time it converts, the crop may already have weathered through this early season sulfur deficiencies. As the plant gets bigger, as the soil gets warmer, the microbes get happier, more sulfur shows up, and typically the sulfur deficiencies go away. But we need to keep that plant happy in the spring, especially the corn, and that's where the sulfate issues come in. But the other thing to remember is sulfates are leachable. So you have to be careful putting sulfates on your sandier soils in the fall, or they could leach away. So again, if we're going to deal with sandy soils, you might be broadcasting sulfates in the spring. If you're going to put fertilizer on in the fall on sandy soils, you probably have to go back to the elemental form. So make sure it doesn't leach away on you in that process. Now, adding small amounts in the starter is a possibility if you're not broadcasting. But do be careful if you're going in furrow, because it doesn't take very much and all of a sudden we've got some seed burn taking place with that sulfur in there itself. Now, from our experience in the plots, putting sulfur on at side dress time with a coulter has not worked very well. While we can get responses in the starter, the responses to a banded sulfur in the coulter it's just too late. By the time that sulfur kicks in, the plant's already fixed itself. Comparing that to a spring broadcast or a fall broadcast in that situation. So the same goes for Y drop. So we're Y dropping V10, V18 corn. Typically, that's going to be too late. And remember, corn's going to have about 80% of its sulfur on board by the time it gets to R1. So waiting to tall corn to put that sulfur application on is probably not going to produce the outcome you're looking for. In this year's plots, we broadcasted AMS, and then we went back in and we added it to the starter, we added it to side dressing, we added it to the Y drop, and basically we didn't get any response beyond just broadcasting that sulfur. In the plots where we applied no sulfur and the fields had no history of sulfur, we did get a response in the starter. We got a bigger response to the broadcast application, and we did get a response to the Y drop application. The one we didn't get a response on, again, big enough to pay the bill, was where we put it in a coulter in the side dress application. So I guess what I'm saying, for most crop tech customers, you're already using sulfur. Most of you have been using sulfur for over 20 years. A situation where adding more sulfur to the picture may not be the case. And I know I've run into that a couple times this winter already, where a guy calls and says, I went to a meeting and they're talking about adding sulfur. They're getting good response. You think we ought to add sulfur to the program? And when I tell them, well, we've been using sulfur for 20 years, so adding sulfur on top of sulfur probably wouldn't make that much difference. But most people don't realize that AMS mix that's in your dry broadcast is taking care of your sulfur needs and keeping your sulfur maintained throughout it, because we're making an application basically every other year. Now, in the situation where we got highly leachable fields, when we're talking about our sandier fields, then we have to be careful with making applications in the fall, because they could leach away. And at that point, we don't have enough sulfur being released season long for the crop, and we do need to break up our applications. So a situation where you may want to do multiple sulfur applications, it could be some at that point with the starter, could be some with the weed and feed, there could be some with the Y drop. Definitely there would be a spot to add it in the pivots. So if we're turning water on that field, we can add sulfur every other turn, or whatever we need to do depending on how things are going at south. But sandy soils are treated quite a bit different than some of your 2.5 to 3.5% soils out here south. We don't want that sulfur to get away from us and then be back out there trying to fix that problem. But the answer is yes, sulfur is important, and here for you guys in the Midwest, and I'm saying Midwest, the I states, we need sulfur for the yields that we're working with for the most part. When we talk about the East Coast and places where there's a lot of people, maybe not yet, not doing any work in that area, I can't say for sure, but if you have a sulfur deficiency in a tissue, you're almost guaranteed to have a nitrogen deficiency as well. We need sulfur on board to metabolize that nitrogen. So hope that helps. Talk to you next week. Keep her safe, keep her moving.